video, we're going to talk about the characteristics of sound and how humans perceive sound and how humans hear sound. Characteristics of sound that we're going to cover include frequency and its relationship to pitch, amplitude, its relationship to volume, and timbre, which is everything that we do in the studio. That's about the color. Let's go. So to understand frequency, we need to know how to measure this, and we measured it in something called wavelengths. And the wavelength is the length for one cycle. Put those cycles together, and the number of times you complete cycles per second is what we get with frequency. When we think about frequency, we measure it in hertz, capital H always. And that's for that guy, Heinrich Hertz. So when we say something is 55 hertz, that means it has 55 cycles per second. That's also known as low A. We think of that as a note, but all frequencies have a note. It's just whether it sounds in tune to Western scale, and depending where you live in the world, things are in tune. So there's our wavelength. You can see we've got starting, there's actually no sound here, there's actually no sound here, and there's actually no sound here. That's called the null point. But we'll use that for, especially in editing. We think of this. So here's one complete cycle, and that's our wavelength. We think of cycles per second. The lower we go, the wider those cycles are. The higher we go, the tighter the cycles. So you can see your 110 hertz, how many cycles happen versus 880 hertz. A lot more is happening, much smaller wavelengths. And this determines everything from wireless microphones to radio signals to TV stations. So actually, stations that are lower on the dial, for instance, the station 2 or station 3 or station 4, would have a farther reach because its wavelengths are longer than a station higher up on the dial. Distance of one wavelength, we call that the period. And period and frequency are inversely proportional. Low frequencies have a long period or a long wavelength. High frequencies have a short. And here's what this sounds like. Now, depending on your playback system, you might not even heard 16 kilohertz. That's also very similar to the, if you know anyone who has an old TV, and these are really, really hard to find, but you can walk into a room, maybe in an old computer lab, and you can just tell that there's a monitor on. That's generally in that 15 to 16K range. So when we're thinking about length, here's what we've got. 50 hertz is about 22 and a half feet long for one wavelength. That's huge. Where 250 hertz is now at about 4.5 feet, and then 1K is about a foot. So when we think about that 1 foot per millisecond, that's about the length of a 1K tone. So we're thinking about size of rooms. If your room's not at least 12 feet wide, you're not going to get a full cycle of 50 hertz. It'll be bouncing around the room all pretty weird, and also why studios sometimes are very big so they can capture some of that low end. Let's talk about pitch for just a second. So thinking about that, we know it's determined from the frequency of the sound waves, and we know higher low frequencies produce higher low pitches. But frequency is scientific, pitch is cultural and very subjective. So whether something's in tune or not tune totally depends on where you are from the world and what kind of music you listen to and what is in tune. So pitch is subjective, frequency is scientific. If you want to go down a rabbit hole, there's a pretty interesting theory on Germany changing what we know of concert A, which is 440 hertz. So it's kind of an interesting rabbit hole if you want to go down there. How do humans hear? Well, when we're born, if everything's working properly, the idea is we can hear from as low as 20 hertz up to as high as 20,000 hertz, or what we'd say is 20K. Not everyone is obviously born with that range, but when both my children were born, pretty much the second day they were born, they wheeled in a laptop cart and started measuring that stuff right away, so to see if there's any issues. As an aside, the range of hearing for animals, and to think about how they tested this, is amazing, but you can see the range. So elephants go down to 5 hertz. Dogs, and we think of dog whistles, right? We know that those go way up above our threshold of hearing. Cats are even higher than that. And bats are beyond that, and dolphins even further. So pretty astounding range of hearing. So, short of elephants, we're kind of weak link on that system. When we think about that related to pitch, and this chart is available in your packet that you should have online. A couple things you can see in that range. So when we think below 20 hertz, we call that infrasonic, down to 0.0001 hertz. And above 20K, we go into the ultrasonic range. So when we get into sampling rates in digital, that'll come up again. But there's definitely information above that. We just, as humans, our playback systems and our ears are generally not in tune to that. So it's kind of interesting. So lots of range. Something to note that I'll tell you if you look here, so 250 hertz, this is kind of a key frequency. You'd see no matter here how low or how high, there's a big range of, in this mid-range where all these instruments exist. And I will tell you, this is where student mixes are really weak, because as you add all these sounds, you need to start parsing this down, because this area can get really, really built up. So you've got low of the bass, maybe high the brightness of the cymbals, which makes a really deep mix, but this buildup in the middle can be very, very overwhelming. As we think about hearing by age, and it's not too early to start thinking about earplugs and of that nature, you can see men and women very similar hearing when they're born, and then as they get older, women have the benefit of hearing much, much longer. So you can see here a 65-year-old woman hears about the same as a 45-year-old man. Coincidentally, you're all in this range, right? So you all have pretty good hearing if you take care of it. Genetics have something to do with it, as well as exposure, and you can damage hearing and it cannot come back. I'm way down here. So we think of amplitude, that's the energy of a wave. And Fletcher-Munson curve will show us that how we hear it is very different. We think of amplitude and related, and we definitely perceive this as volume, but they're a little bit different. So we measure this in decibels, named after Alexander Graham Bell. So Bell of decibel is always, the B is always capital as well. The bell is not a usable standard, but we use the decibel, so 1/10 of a bell. If you remember from 113 and other classes, the decibel is a ratio, so 1 decibel doesn't mean anything. We're using that as shortcut. That's fine for our situation right now, so 1 dB SPL. When we think about amplitude, what's interesting is that humans can localize sound, and the minimum that, as we study people, is 1 dB. Again, using this as a ratio, if we're thinking about a fader or an EQ move, though, that's what will go on. So if you're making any moves less than that on the computer or on a mixer, you really aren't being able to hear a difference. So perceived amplitude change of 1 decibel. And how do we localize sound? Well, it's super interesting. Our ears are faced in one way. So once you pause the video, and you can even grab 2 folders or 2 books, this is super interesting, is to hold this in front of your ears and behind your ears, and to hear how different this sounds, your voice sounds, how you can change. Even something as thin as a manila folder can ultimately change the sound. I'll wait, you go ahead. When we think about amplitude, we do want to talk about the dangers of this. And again, this is review, but thinking about this 105 decibel, pretty crucial range. This happens to also be generally some of the hand dryers that are in the bathrooms are about 105 dB, outrageously loud. I hate those things. This is also related to exposure. So you can see this 85 dB, 8 hours a day, that's safe. But otherwise, and even then, that can be a lot. So not just how loud it is, but loudness and length of exposure can put you in danger. When we're thinking about amplitude, the threshold of hearing is 0 dB. So from no sound to I can hear something, that is where we start. The ratio is 0 dB, threshold. And then when we get to where it starts to hurt, we call that the threshold of pain. Happens at 120 to 140 dB range. 2 terms you'll want to know. But amplitude is not loudness. We think of it in related to volume, but you can see here, I have this video. Audio is not great on here, but it'll get the point across, is that I've got different tones, 80 hertz, 440, 1K, 5K, and 15K. And you can see they're all at the same exact amplitude. So the blocks of audio look exactly the same, but how we perceive them as loudness is totally different. Let's take a listen. Your playback system might not even get the last one. They all sound very different. And we're most in tune to the mid-range, so that 1K probably sound the loudest. And these two gentlemen, Fletcher-Munson, also studied this, and this is called the Fletcher-Munson curve. And this says based on the frequency and the level, so we're not going to get into FONs, but the SPL, sound pressure level, what we think of as volume, we hear very differently. So you can hear, so at about 85 dB, it takes this much energy of a 20 hertz signal to sound the same as this 500 this much energy for a 500 hertz tone over here to the 1K tone. So you can see that's the reference. That's where it needed the least amount. We're in tune. Needed kind of the flat line of the energy level. So as you get higher, it was taking less and less sound, less and less volume, less and less amplitude for it to sound the same. And then as you got even higher beyond that, it started to take more. And then as we started that 1K, as we go down, it was taking a little bit less, a little bit less. And then as you get deeper and deeper on the frequency scale, it started to take more and more and more and more. That's to all that make that sound the same. So when someone says, are these two notes the same volume? That's what they got. So here, for this example, 100 hertz signal at 50 dB is here. And then to make it sound about the same, took 13 dB less for the 500 hertz and 18 dB for 3.5K. As an interesting aside, humans can detect a sound that displaces air particles by 1/1000th of a centimeter. You don't need to know that for a test. It's just interesting. That's how fine-tuned we are. So what does it mean twice as loud? Well, it takes about 10 dB of pressure to make something sound about twice as loud. That's psychoacoustic. That's not scientific measuring. That's just saying, oh, that sounds twice as loud. If we add a source, for instance, if we add a second speaker, we get about 3 dB extra in volume. We don't get twice as loud. So just adding another speaker doesn't make it sound twice as loud. You get about 3 dB. That's called the inverse square law. Doubling of the distance away from the sound in the SPL reduces in half. A lot of this is related to live sound, and we'll come back again, but I wanted to get these formulas in place and have you thinking about it. Amplitude is the size of the vibrations, and it is very measurable. We think of dB and loudness as the same thing. They are not. Amplitude, it is related to loudness, but they are not the same thing. Loudness is frequency dependent from we heard tones and from the Fletcher-Munson curve. Given the same amplitude, the tones do not sound the same volume to our ears. Fletcher-Munson curve says our ideal critical listening volume is about 85 dB. So if you're in the studio and maybe there's an app for your phone or some of the studios have SPL meters, that should be sitting about 85 dB. Timbre is the tonal color when we think of overtones and harmonics and all the color of a sound. Everything we do in the studio is about timbre. We have a tuning fork, a flute, voice, and a violin. They were all to play the same note. It's the attack, the decay. They all could be playing the same note, but you can see how each different the timbre is to achieve that note. A tuning fork gives us the pure sound, and as we get more complex, things change. Microphones are about capturing timbre. The following two examples, I'll be using the SPAN plugin, which is a frequency response plugin that lets us see what's happening with the different frequencies of a sound. Now, the acoustic guitar is a 6-string instrument, so super complex. And you can see the overtones for that. But notice on the voice, which is a monophonic source, meaning he's just singing one note at a time. Notice the complexity of the signal.
As I start to drown, will you set me free or melt me like gold?
So everything we do in the studio is about capturing those overtones and harmonics. This is a picture of a frequency response chart. This is how we measure speakers and microphones and the resulting sonic effect. So you can see here, as this microphone was placed usually at 1 meter from a sound source, it wasn't picking up 60 hertz so well, did pretty well in the mid-range, and then as it got above into the high mids, it started having this frequency response with this little dip here and this up, and then as it got above 10K, started to really drop off, and then it didn't pick up anything close to 20 hertz. So this SM58 did not pick up 20 hertz, did not pick up 20K, And this is how we look. Now, it doesn't tell us what the microphone is good for, but it lets us look at the microphone and say, like, that's what we can expect. That ultimately is the EQ that you're putting on a source when you choose that microphone. You're saying, that's the EQ that I want to use.